Before the velvet curtain rose, before the orchestra lifted its breath, there she stood, Ida Rubinstein, tall and still, her hands resting lightly against the thick fabric, her pulse moving in quiet defiance of the hush that filled the theater. Paris had gathered that night not only to watch a performance, but to witness an upheaval. The scent of flowers brought by admirers mingled with powder and perfume, thick in the air. Somewhere in the crowd, a gloved hand trembled, unsure whether in outrage or desire, and behind that curtain she smiled to no one, as if she already knew how the night would remember her. My dear listener, before we begin this long wandering through time, I invite you to share a simple thought. Tell me in the quiet of the comments below where and when you are listening. In this way, your moment will be gently tied to others around the world, as if we were all remembering together. And if this story carries you somewhere far and still, I invite you to join this channel, to keep the memory alive and moving onward, softly. The curtain fades, and we begin, not in Paris, but far away, where winter presses its fingers against the windows of St. Petersburg. Snow falls heavily, not in flurries, but in quiet, endless drifts, as though the city has grown weary of sound. A carriage passes on cobblestones, muffled beneath the weight of white. Inside a grand house, a child lies awake beneath high ceilings that seem older than her own breath. Her name is Ida, and she is wrapped in the softness of silk sheets, yet the silence that surrounds her is not the kind that comforts. It is the silence of rooms too large for a child, of echoes that never quite settle. Wealth was her inheritance, but so too was absence. Her father, a man of great fortune, was taken by death before she could truly know the shape of his face. Her mother followed when Ida was still so young that the world had not yet grown a definite outline. Orphaned, she was raised by guardians who loved respectability more than they loved art, who valued the whisper of propriety over the wilder call of the world. They clothed her in the finest fabrics, educated her with rigid care, and surrounded her with 1,000 objects meant to shield her from the unpredictable. But they could not quiet the wind that found its way through the smallest cracks, nor the thoughts that grew in the shadowed corners of her mind. In that house, the air always seemed perfumed with something floral but faint, like memories of summer, caught in winter's throat. The clock struck each hour with gentle finality, and with each sound she grew more aware of the way time stretched slowly, like a ribbon with no end. There was no stage here, no lights, no crowd, only her, the frost on the windows, and the faint sounds of a distant city living beyond the iron gate. It was here that her sense of the world began, a place where everything was provided but nothing was lived. Some children bloom within safety, others ache against it like a locked door. Ida was of the latter kind. Even then, her eyes carried a certain far-off look, as though she were already standing elsewhere. She did not yet know the shape of scandal or art, of fame or rebellion, but she felt the hum of something beneath the surface. It was a quiet, pulsing rhythm that grew louder whenever the adults around her spoke of duty, decorum, of what a young woman of her name must become. Perhaps it was then that she began to understand that the truest cages are not made of walls or bars, but of expectations woven delicately, invisibly, like lace. It is easy to love lace when you do not notice how it binds the wrists. And in the cold of St. Petersburg, where chandeliers glittered and every surface seemed polished to reflect an image of perfection, she began to notice the difference between reflection and reality. She spent long hours in the evening standing at the window, watching sleighs glide through the snow. The city beyond was both near and unreachable, the life outside vibrant with the kind of roughness that her own existence lacked. In the quiet of her room, she whispered lines of stories she had overheard from servants, from books she was not supposed to read. She imagined stages in distant cities, theaters where light moved like water, where a woman might stand before the world and speak not with permission but with her own breath. But for now, she was a child under watchful eyes. Her guardians brought in tutors who taught her languages and manners, history and the proper way to sit, to smile, to be admired without drawing too much attention. They taught her to glide through rooms like a well-bred swan, silent and graceful. Yet beneath that smoothness, a current stirred. Some nights she would let her hand rest against the window pane until it grew numb with cold, as if she were trying to feel the world beyond through the glass. Her mother's portrait hung in one of the parlors, framed in gold. The woman in the painting had the same high brow, the same gaze that carried more questions than comfort. Ida would sit before it for hours, tracing the lines of the woman's painted face with her eyes. She would never say it aloud, but she often wondered if the same hunger had lived in her mother, too. A hunger for something beyond wealth, beyond safety, beyond the careful choreography of society. The house was a world of rituals. Breakfasts served on china, letters opened with silver knives, servants stepping softly so as not to disturb the endless, perfumed quiet. And yet, if one listened closely, beneath all of it was another sound, the soft cracking of something not yet broken, but bending. It is not the loud shattering that begins a rebellion. It is the whisper. It is the child pressing her palm against the frost on the window, dreaming of a world where she does not have to ask permission to breathe. Years later, those who spoke of her as a scandal, a muse, or a dangerous woman would forget these early winters. They would not imagine the stillness in which she first learned to hear herself. But perhaps that is where the fire was born, in a quiet so deep that the first flicker of desire to step beyond it burned with clarity. And as the snow thickened that night, as carriages disappeared into the mist of the St. Petersburg winter, a small flame from the candle on her bedside table trembled. Her eyes stayed open, watching it. The frost on the glass grew thicker, but the flame did not die. Outside, the city breathed in slow, muffled sounds. Inside, the girl who would become Ida Rubinstein lay beneath layers of silk, and for the first time, the silence was not heavy. It was full of possibility. The candle flickered again, and the room seemed to breathe with her. The frost on the window held through the night, as if determined to keep the world outside, separate from the world within. The next morning, before the servants' feet could be heard on the polished floors, young Ida slipped from her bed with the quiet precision of a thought not yet spoken aloud. The air bit at her skin, the kind of sharp cold that leaves no room for hesitation, and the silence wrapped around her like a thin, invisible shawl. In the distance, the bells of St. Petersburg began to toll with their slow, measured rhythm, and she wondered if anyone else heard the pause between each sound as clearly as she did. Perhaps the bells marked hours for others, but for her they were small reminders of a world that moved without asking. Her days were structured like fine porcelain, delicate and cold to the touch. Lessons were long, spoken in soft tones by governesses who carried their own secrets in tightly closed mouths. They taught her French, German, and Italian, believing that languages were jewels to be worn by women of her standing. She learned history from the perspective of conquerors, never from those who had been conquered. She learned music not for its wildness, but for its discipline. Every note, every step, every gesture was measured against the invisible weight of what was expected. She listened to their instructions with lowered lashes, but something within her always stood apart, as if observing a scene rather than belonging to it. There were gardens behind the house, trimmed and ordered like everything else in her life. Even in winter, when the snow lay thick upon the hedges, the paths remained clear, as if disorder itself were not permitted on the estate. Sometimes she would walk those paths alone, her boots pressing soft impressions into the white surface, leaving behind delicate trails that would vanish as soon as the next snowfall came. She liked the way her footprints disappeared, as if she had never been there at all. It gave her a strange sense of freedom to imagine herself as a ghost moving through the edges of a carefully controlled world. The adults in her life spoke often about the future. They spoke of proper matches, of alliances, of the kind of life that would secure her place in a society that was as rigid as the winter ground beneath their feet. They spoke of marriage as if it were an elegant cage, one gilded enough that the bird inside might mistake it for the sky. She listened, nodding when required, but her mind drifted elsewhere. She imagined a world where a woman could stand in front of an audience, not to be married or admired from a distance, but to claim a space that belonged to her alone. She did not yet have the words to name such a world, but she could feel it pulling at her like a thread. Sometimes she found refuge in the attic, where old trunks and forgotten garments from other eras were stored. Among them were her mother's dresses, wrapped in tissue that smelled faintly of violets, long faded. There were gloves, lace veils, worn slippers, and fan-folded silk that sighed when touched. It was in this hidden world of fabric and shadow that Ida first played at transformation. She would drape a shawl across her shoulders, step into shoes far too large for her feet, and look at her reflection in the dusty mirror. For a moment, she was not the child everyone expected her to be, but someone else entirely. Someone who could command the room, not simply inhabit it. The attic was quiet, save for the distant rumble of the city's life below. In that silence, she learned how to listen to the language of costumes, the way fabric could carry both memory and desire. Her guardians saw these moments as harmless fancies. They believed a young girl must amuse herself while waiting for her future to arrive. But Ida understood something different. She felt that the future they spoke of was not the one meant for her. The world outside the gates of their estate called to her not in shouts, but in soft, insistent murmurs. She felt it in the way the light shifted through the windows at dusk, how the sound of distant horses echoed like a promise, how the cold air burned against her cheeks when she leaned too far out into the night. The theater entered her life not through a door, but through a whisper. One of the servants, believing her asleep, spoke softly with another in the kitchen one night, describing a performance she had seen. A stage filled with light, dancers who moved like smoke and water, and a woman who commanded every gaze without uttering a word. The servant's words were not meant for her, yet they reached her like a spark touching dry kindling. The idea of a stage, of becoming more than just a silent figure in a silent room, rooted itself in her. When she closed her eyes at night, she began to imagine this stage. She pictured curtains the color of wine, a hush falling over a crowd, the warmth of lights on her face, and the way the world might change if she stepped into that space and let the silence of her childhood become something larger, something luminous. It was not ambition in the ordinary sense, it was hunger. And hunger, once awakened, does not sleep again. The lessons continued. The seasons turned. Her beauty, even as a girl, was noted by those around her in hushed, approving tones. She carried it not as a jewel, but as a weight, aware already that beauty draws eyes but not always understanding. In drawing rooms, strangers praised her elegance, her poise, her calm. But they could not see the restless rhythm beneath the stillness. No one ever does at first. And so, as another winter night deepened, she returned to her room, closing the door softly behind her. The candle on her bedside table burned low, casting long, trembling shadows on the ceiling. She lay still beneath her sheets, her hands resting against her chest, feeling the steady rise and fall of her breath. Outside, the snow kept falling. The world was unchanged. Yet somewhere within her, something had shifted. A thin thread had been pulled loose, and though the tapestry still held, it would never be quite the same again. The flame of the candle bent in the draught, just barely, like a bowing figure on a distant stage. The mornings grew heavier with routine as the years turned, as though each winter layered another veil upon the house, softening its edges but thickening its silence. Ida's world was measured in hours of lessons, in footsteps echoing through halls where the portraits of ancestors watched with solemn, unchanging expressions. The city outside the gate belonged to another kind of life, one of unpredictability and noise. But inside, everything was arranged in the same order, as though to protect a fragile certainty. It was in that stillness that she began to collect her secrets, small and careful at first, like pebbles hidden in a pocket. Among those secrets was a single folded program from a small theater in St. Petersburg, a place she had never visited but heard about in whispers. The servant who brought it in thought little of handing it to her, believing it was a passing fancy, a bit of childish curiosity. But Ida held onto it as one holds onto a promise. The paper smelled faintly of dust and grease paint, and its corners were frayed where other hands had clutched it before hers. Late at night, with the candlelight trembling against the walls, she would unfold it and trace the letters with her fingertips as if reading a map to somewhere distant. Her guardians did not know that she had begun to sneak into the library when the house fell silent. It was a room filled with heavy furniture, books bound in leather, and the faint smell of polished wood. The works her tutors selected for her were proper and measured, filled with noble history and approved philosophies. But deeper on the shelves were plays, translations of poets, and a few volumes smuggled in from Paris, where the air was said to be dangerous and alive. She read them slowly at first, mouthing words she barely understood, feeling their weight on her tongue. These books were not made to teach her how to be, but how to imagine. The city's theater culture whispered to her from beyond the gate. She overheard fragments of conversation when the older women visited for tea, speaking with carefully disguised delight about performances that scandalized and enthralled in equal measure. They spoke of actresses who dared to move differently, who looked men in the eyes instead of lowering their lashes, who wore costumes that blurred the boundary between reverence and provocation. They disapproved, of course, but Ida could hear the tremor beneath their scorn, the way fascination and envy so often walk hand in hand. As she grew older, she began to practice gestures alone in the attic. It started as play. A hand lifted, a turn of the head, a pose held just long enough to feel the stillness ripple. She would imagine an audience in the dark beyond the rafters, their eyes watching her, breathing with her. The quiet became a stage, the shadows her silent spectators. It was in these solitary rehearsals that she discovered something she had not known she possessed: control. Not the obedient control her guardians admired, but something more fluid, more alive. The kind of control that could hold the air in a room still without a word. Her guardians noticed her detachment from their carefully woven plans. At luncheons, she sat with the posture of a young woman well-bred, but her gaze drifted past the faces before her. Suitors were mentioned, and sometimes presented, men who spoke in the assured tone of those who believed they were the center of every story. She listened, smiled when required, but in her mind, the theater curtain was already rising somewhere else. She was a guest in her own life, waiting for the moment to step out of the drawing room and into the unknown. The city beyond grew louder each year. Parisian fashions arrived with merchants. Performances that defied old forms were whispered about more openly. In the newspapers, she began to see images of dancers, of actresses, of women whose names did not belong to husbands or fathers. They belonged to themselves, or at least appeared to. She would sit by the window with the paper spread delicately across her lap, pretending to be absorbed in polite articles about the imperial family, while her eyes searched for any hint of this other world. These women were not discussed in her lessons, but they lived in the edges of conversations, in the quickened pulse of gossip. She began to ask questions that her governess could not answer, about art, about performance, about the city's theaters. The governess frowned and reminded her that such places were not appropriate for someone of her name and station, But Ida learned something important then. The more forbidden a thing is named, the more clearly it begins to take shape. The idea of the stage was no longer a distant spark, but a steady light in her mind. She knew now that it existed, that it was out there waiting, and that no rule spoken within those walls could erase its presence. One evening, after the household had gone to sleep, she stole down the hallway with the folded program in her hand and pressed her forehead against the cold window pane at the end of the corridor. The street beyond was buried in snow, but she could see the faint glow of lamps in the distance. Somewhere past those lights, someone was stepping onto a stage, a curtain was being drawn back, and an audience was falling silent. She imagined the warmth of those lights on her skin, the sound of breath held in anticipation. She felt it as surely as if she were standing there herself. Her life was still governed by rules and schedules, by expectations that weighed upon her like a fine but unyielding fabric. But rebellion does not always come as a loud break. Sometimes it arrives quietly, curling around the edges of routine, soft but persistent, like ivy that cannot be trained to stop climbing. Ida's rebellion was not yet visible to anyone else, not even fully to herself, but it was there. In the attic, in the library, in the careful way she folded the program after each stolen glance. As the winter wind rattled the shutters and the house sighed in its sleep, she pressed her palm against the cold glass and whispered the name of the theater she had read on the program. She did not know when or how she would cross that threshold, but she knew that she would. The night she finally stepped out into the city without permission, the air was sharp enough to make every breath taste of iron and frost. She moved quietly through the back corridor of the house, a narrow passage lined with portraits she had grown to despise, faces of ancestors who seemed to glare down with the weight of centuries. The servants had long since gone to bed, the governess's light had been extinguished, and the house exhaled that deep, slow sigh it always did when the world outside was wide awake, and it was not. She wrapped a dark shawl around her shoulders, not to protect herself from the cold, but to silence her presence, to blend with the shadows that waited for her beyond the door. It was the first real lie of her life, not the gentle evasions she had practiced before, but a step taken deliberately against the path drawn for her. The snow lay in thick, undisturbed sheets upon the street, and as she walked, the sound of her boots was swallowed by it. She felt no fear, only an almost unbearable stillness inside her, as if something she had carried silently for too long had finally found the smallest crack through which to breathe. The city was not asleep. Windows glimmered faintly, distant carriages passed with their wheels muffled, and from somewhere she could not see came the distant sound of laughter. It was not the polite laughter of drawing rooms, but something freer, less contained. She did not know the way precisely, but she carried in her mind a map formed from overheard fragments and stolen glances at newspapers. Each step felt both uncertain and inevitable. She passed streets she had only ever seen from the safety of a carriage window, their cobblestones uneven beneath her feet, their smells unfamiliar. A mix of smoke, wine, and something older, human and alive. For the first time in her life, she was not the girl in silk under watchful eyes. She was just a figure moving through the night, small but free. When she reached the theater, it did not look like the world she had imagined. It was older, more worn, its stone cracked and its entrance flanked by two flickering lanterns that gave off more shadow than light. But there was something about it that felt alive in a way the polished halls of her house never had. A thin stream of people slipped through the doors. Artists, workers, students, women wrapped in scarves instead of jewels. No one turned to stare at her. No one recognized the weight of her name. She was simply another body among bodies. She had never known how liberating anonymity could be. Inside, the air was warm and thick with the scent of perfume, mingled with sweat and oil lamps. The sound of voices swelled and broke like waves, growing louder as she moved further in. She found a place near the back of the hall where she could see without being seen. The velvet curtain, old but still holding its faded grandeur, shimmered faintly in the light. She had seen velvet before, in drawing rooms, in gowns, but never like this. Here it was not decoration, but a threshold. When the orchestra began to tune, the sound rose slowly, like a storm gathering its breath. A murmur swept through the audience, not of politeness but of collective anticipation. Ida felt her heart beat with theirs, a pulse she had never shared with anyone before. Then the curtain lifted. The dancer who emerged was not the vision of grace she had been taught to admire at carefully choreographed balls. She was angular, deliberate, and her movements carried a wildness that seemed to slice the air open. Her costume shimmered in deep reds and golds, but it was her eyes that caught Ida's breath. They were not the eyes of a woman asking for approval. They were the eyes of someone who owned every inch of the space around her. She moved not as if performing for the audience, but as if commanding them, bending their attention like light through glass. Ida leaned forward, the shawl slipping from her shoulders. Her body had never learned this language, but her soul recognized it instantly. Each gesture of the dancer felt like a secret being spoken aloud, something she had always known but never had the courage to say. Around her, the audience murmured, gasped, clapped, whispered. Some disapproved, some adored. All were caught. Ida did not look away once, and then something she did not expect. She began to cry, not with loud sobs, but with the quiet, steady tears of someone who has finally found the name of something they had been searching for in silence. The sound of the orchestra blurred, the figures around her faded. All that remained was the dancer and the certainty that Ida could never return to the life she had before this night. When the final note hung in the air like a held breath, the audience erupted. She did not join them. She remained still, her hands cold, her shawl forgotten at her feet. She understood, without quite understanding, that a door had opened inside her. She did not yet know how she would step through it. She only knew that she must. She walked back through the streets just before dawn, when the world hovers between night and day. The snow was untouched once again, as though no one had walked its streets. Her shawl smelled faintly now of the theater, of lamp smoke and perfume, of something alive. She held it close to her chest as though it were the fragile proof of a secret. The house was quiet when she returned, its hallways unchanged, its portraits still watching, but everything within her was different. She moved past their gazes without lowering her eyes. She climbed the stairs without listening for creaks. She reached her room and lay upon her bed without lighting a candle, letting the dark hold her as the theater had. For the first time, the silence of her room no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a beginning. The days that followed that night passed like a river running beneath a thin crust of ice. Silent on the surface, restless underneath. No one in the house noticed that something had shifted in her. Her guardians still spoke in their measured tones, arranging the details of a life she no longer inhabited, their conversations floating past her like smoke through a winter room. They spoke of suitors and invitations, of charity luncheons, and the expectations placed upon a young woman of her standing. She nodded when required, smiled when required, but inside, she was back in the theater, breathing the heavy warmth of that room, listening to the orchestra tuning as if it were a heartbeat. Her shawl still carried the faint scent of that night, lamp oil, perfume, and something faintly metallic like the taste of anticipation. She kept it hidden beneath the mattress, not because she feared discovery, but because she wanted it close, like a promise folded against her skin. She took it out at night, when the house grew still, and held it to her chest. Closing her eyes, she would imagine the dancer stepping out onto the stage, the sound of breath catching in the crowd, the way the air shifted as she moved. It was a memory too vivid to fade, too alive to remain only a memory. and slowly she began to mimic those movements in the privacy of the attic. At first, her body felt stiff, trained only to sit properly, to glide in a ballroom, to obey forms that were meant to contain rather than release. But night after night, as the snow deepened outside, she returned to that secret room beneath the rafters. She pushed aside the trunks, spread her shawl on the wooden floor, and began again. Her body was not yet a dancer's, but her will was. The attic creaked with her every step, her breath echoed in the shadows, and the moonlight through the small window traced her outline as she moved. Her first movements were hesitant, a careful echo of what she had seen. But as weeks bled into months, she stopped trying to imitate and began to become. She found a rhythm that belonged to her, something neither taught nor borrowed. It was not perfection she sought, she knew nothing of that world, but a way to give shape to the hunger that had lived inside her for so long. When she closed her eyes, the theater was there again, not as an audience she feared, but as a world that waited. The winter eventually broke, and with the thaw came new sounds through the city, carts rolling, bells ringing, the calls of vendors as the streets awoke from their slumber. She watched from the window as the city changed and felt the same quiet shift inside herself. She was no longer waiting. She was moving towards something, even if she could not yet name it. One evening, she overheard her guardians discussing a friend of the family who ran a modest acting school on the outskirts of the city. The man was described with a hint of condescension as one who dabbled in theater but belonged reassuringly to their circle. They planned to visit him in the spring. Ida listened silently from the hallway, her hand resting against the wall, feeling her pulse in her fingertips. That single conversation became her first thread of escape. When the day came, they took a carriage through streets that glittered with melting snow and early sunlight. Her guardians believed it to be an outing of polite acquaintance, but Ida sat with her gloved hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed not on the passing buildings, but on a future that felt suddenly close enough to touch. The acting school was small, tucked between two old stone structures. From the outside, it looked unremarkable, but when she stepped through its doors, she felt it immediately. The air was different. Inside, voices filled the space not with polite restraint, but with urgency. Young men and women moved across the worn wooden floor in loose formations, some reciting lines, others standing silent with their eyes closed, as if listening inward. The scent of dust and chalk filled the room, mingled with the warmth of bodies in motion. Ida's guardians exchanged uneasy glances, their fine coats and polished boots out of place here. She, on the other hand, felt no such discomfort. This was the opposite of her world, and it felt like home. The man who ran the school greeted them with courteous enthusiasm. He had the look of one who had spent his life in theaters, slightly disheveled, eyes quick, hands expressive even when he stood still. He spoke to her guardians in the practiced language of social niceties, assuring them that his work was modest and proper. But when his gaze fell upon Ida, it paused, not with desire, not with judgment, but with recognition. He had seen her kind before, perhaps not her face, but the fire behind it. They did not allow her to participate, of course. She was to observe, no more than that, but watching was enough. She stood near the edge of the room, her gloved hands growing warm, the shawl beneath her coat pressing against her heart. She watched the students move with urgency, as if their lives depended on each breath, each gesture. She envied them their freedom, but more than envy, she felt certainty. One day she would not stand on the edge. Her guardians were polite as they left, speaking of how charming it was, how curious. But she barely heard them. The rhythm of their carriage wheels against the stones was drowned out by the echo of voices in that room, by the sound of feet on wood, by the quiet thunder of her own pulse. That night, she returned to the attic and did not imitate. She moved with the knowledge that her future would no longer belong to parlors or drawing rooms. She was not yet a dancer, not yet an actress, not yet the figure whose name would echo through scandal and admiration alike. She was still just a girl, but now she was a girl who had glimpsed the doorway and understood without a doubt that she would walk through it. The attic was cold, but she did not feel it. Her body moved, her breath rose in thin clouds, and the silence bent around her like an audience holding its breath. The arrival of spring in St. Petersburg brought with it a slow uncoiling of the city, as if it had been sleeping beneath the ice and was only now remembering how to breathe. The Neva loosened its grip. The river cracked in long, echoing lines, and the air filled with the scent of thawing earth and damp stone. In the streets, vendors called louder, carriages moved faster, and theaters came to life in a way that winter could never permit. For Ida, the season did not bring softness but a quiet resolve. The decision she had carried silently through the long, dark months had taken root. She would not simply dream of another life. She would step into it. Her guardians continued their lives unaware of the change that bloomed inside her. They believed her calmness to be obedience, her quiet to be the silence of good breeding. But it was not silence they were looking at. It was concentration. Each evening after their polite dinners, when conversation drifted into the predictable rhythms of society, Ida would retreat to the attic. The snow that once gathered on the window had melted now, and the pale light of late spring crept in and cast its soft glow upon the floorboards. She practiced movements, gestures, lines she had copied in secret from plays, shaping her body to the rhythm of a life that was still invisible to everyone but her. She began to collect names of theaters, of directors, of performers whispered about with equal parts scandal and awe. These she carried like a rosary of rebellion. She overheard a cousin speak of a company rehearsing a new adaptation of Salome by Oscar Wilde, a work already infamous for the way it blurred beauty with provocation. The name of the piece alone made her pulse quicken. She knew nothing yet of its structure, its staging, or its scandal, but she understood its reputation, and she wanted to be near it. Opportunities for women of her station to slip beyond the ornamental role society offered were rare, but she was clever. She understood that the greatest rebellion often came disguised in obedience. She spoke little, listened much, and slowly traced a path between gossip, half-heard names, and the quiet network of those who existed on the edges of respectable society. It was among these edges that artists lived, those who were both adored and condemned, who were spoken of with fascination over tea, but rarely invited into the rooms where her guardians lived. She wanted not to observe them, but to join them. Her first attempt to find her way into that world came on a mild evening, when the last of the snow had finally given way to soft earth. She dressed not in her usual silks, but in a plain wool coat, the kind a servant might wear if no one looked too closely. Her hair she tucked beneath a scarf, her face unpainted, her hands gloveless. It was the kind of disguise that did not hide her beauty, but muted it, made it less remarkable, easier to let her slip through the streets unnoticed. She walked quickly, as though afraid that if she stopped, the weight of her upbringing would pull her back. The small theater where the company rehearsed stood near the edge of the city, its exterior plain, its windows fogged from within. Through the door came faint music, voices, and the dull sound of movement on a wooden stage. She stood at the threshold for a long moment, her hand on the door, the city's night pressing close behind her. It would have been easy to turn away, to walk back to the warm, predictable house, to the silk sheets and the quiet of a life that demanded nothing but obedience. But then she thought of that night months ago, of the dancer who had moved with such wild certainty, and she pushed the door open. Inside, the room was warm and smelled of resin and dust, the air alive with activity. A pianist sat at a small upright, playing fragments of something dark and slow. A few women moved across the floor, their skirts lifted just enough to free their legs, their gestures sharp and precise. A man with a narrow face and restless hands barked instructions in a voice that carried authority without cruelty. Ida stood near the back of the room, her coat still buttoned, trying to make herself invisible. But something about the way she watched gave her away. The director noticed her first. He did not ask her name, did not question why she was there. He simply watched her with the detached gaze of someone who had seen 100 hopeful faces and recognized the few that carried something different. One of the dancers glanced over her shoulder and smirked, whispering something Ida could not hear. But the director lifted his hand and the whispers ceased. He stepped toward her slowly, not like a man approaching a stranger, but like someone measuring a possibility. "You've come to watch," he said simply. She nodded. Her voice would have betrayed her. Her heart was beating too fast. "You can stay," he added, before turning back to his dancers. "But if you stay, you watch with intent, not with eyes that wander." She remained, standing still as the rehearsal unfolded before her. They were working through a scene from Salome. The dance, the turning point of the play, the moment meant to both seduce and disturb. The movements were unlike anything she had seen before, neither the delicate formality of the ballet nor the contained precision of salon performances. It was a language of control and release, of something sacred turned profane and then made beautiful again. She did not understand it fully, but she felt it entirely. For several nights she returned, unnoticed by her guardians who believed her tucked safely in her bed. She stood in the same place, watching, absorbing, learning without instruction. She studied the dancers' faces, their hands, the way they carried silence as much as sound. She learned to breathe with them, though she never stepped forward. It was enough for now to belong to that darkened room, to be near the world she wanted to claim. Then, one evening, when one of the dancers fell ill, the director's gaze shifted to the back of the room where she always stood. He said nothing for a long moment, only studied her as if testing the shape of the thought forming in his mind. Then he motioned with a single hand. "You. Step forward." Ida froze. Her pulse roared in her ears. The dancers glanced at one another, some amused, some curious. She did not belong here, not by their measures, not by anyone's. But her body moved before her mind could protest. She stepped forward, the sound of her boots against the wood loud in the quiet. "Remove the coat," the director said. She hesitated only a moment, then unbuttoned the plain wool and let it fall to the floor. Underneath she wore a simple dress, nothing theatrical, but her poise was unmistakable. He did not ask for her name, did not ask if she could dance. He simply said, "Begin." She had no choreography. She had only the nights in the attic, the fragments of movement learned in the shadows, the memory of that first performance etched beneath her skin. But as the pianist began to play, something within her answered. She moved not with the polish of training, but with the instinct of someone who has carried a fire for too long and finally found a place to let it breathe. Her arms sliced the air, her feet struck the wood with soft insistence, her body curved like a line of smoke rising from a hidden flame. The room fell silent. The dancers no longer smirked. The director no longer watched with calculation. He watched as one who has found a rare and dangerous thing. When the music ended, she stood breathless, her hair loosened, her chest rising and falling. No one spoke. The director only nodded, once, slowly. "Come again tomorrow," he said. She gathered her coat but did not put it back on. She walked into the cool night with her hair unbound and her hands warm. The city seemed changed, though it was the same. She had crossed a line that could not be crossed back. The following days unfolded like the slow unfurling of a long-hidden script, each line written somewhere beneath her skin, long before she ever stepped into that room. Ida returned to the theater each evening, slipping out of her house like a shadow, the shawl no longer a secret but a banner of her quiet defiance. At first, no one spoke to her. She was a stranger among them, a girl who had appeared out of nowhere, whose soft hands and careful posture betrayed a world far from the dusty boards of the rehearsal floor. Yet when the music began, all such differences dissolved. She became a presence they could not ignore. The director did not praise her, nor did he correct her often. He observed in silence, giving her small adjustments. A hand placed here, a turn slowed down, a breath held longer. It was a kind of training that did not coddle but trusted her to find the shape of her own movement. She absorbed everything with a hunger that startled even herself. Each night as the pianist began to play, she felt the rigid structures of her upbringing peel away, like layers of fabric stripped down to something bare and real. She learned to let silence move through her limbs, to let stillness speak as much as gesture. The role she had stepped into was not a formal casting. It was temporary, a replacement for a dancer whose illness kept her from rehearsals. Yet with each night, Ida became less a visitor and more a part of the room. The dancers, at first skeptical, began to watch her differently. There was something in the way she carried herself, not polished, not trained, but charged with an intensity that made their own practiced steps seem suddenly cautious. She moved like someone who did not need to be told what was forbidden because she had already decided to step beyond it. Outside the theater, the city moved through its ordinary spring rhythms, unaware of the storm gathering in one young woman's quiet rebellion. Her guardians still believed her obedient, her calm face an assurance that the proper path of a proper life lay ahead. They could not see that every night their carefully constructed world slipped further from her grasp. She no longer lingered in parlors or listened to the delicate conversations about respectable suitors. She did not dream of marriage or drawing rooms, or even of escape in the conventional sense. She dreamed of the stage, not as a place of applause, but as a space where she could simply exist on her own terms. It was during those rehearsals that she learned something deeper than movement. She learned the weight of presence. The director often stopped the music without warning, forcing the dancers to stand in silence before one another, to hold their stillness and let it fill the room. At first, this unnerved her. The way the silence pressed against her chest, the way every breath seemed to echo. But slowly she came to understand that this was the heartbeat of performance. It was not the steps themselves that held the audience. It was the space between them, the pause, the moment suspended like the hush before a confession. The play itself was spoken about in whispers even among the company. Salome was considered dangerous, not because of its words alone, but because of the way it dared to show desire, faith, and death in a single breath. For many, it was a scandal that a woman's body could carry both sanctity and sin without asking for permission. The dancer's role, the one she now inhabited, was at the center of that fire. It was not simply a dance, it was a question thrown into the heart of society. At the end of each rehearsal, when the others gathered their things and laughed quietly among themselves, she lingered. Sometimes the director remained as well, sitting on the edge of the stage with his cigarette burning between his fingers, the smoke drifting slowly toward the rafters. He did not ask her about her life, nor she about his. But in the quiet, something unspoken passed between them, an understanding that she did not belong to the world she came from, and that he had recognized it the moment she stepped through the door. One night, as the others left, he said, without turning to her, "If you keep moving like that, you will not remain hidden for long." She looked at him, the question resting behind her lips, but not spoken. "You cannot dance like this in shadows," he continued. "The stage will call you out, and once it does, the world will not let you go quietly back to where you came from." She did not answer. She didn't need to. The truth of his words had already taken root in her. She walked home under a sky that was neither fully dark nor light, that strange hour when the city holds its breath. She knew she was walking a line that could not be walked backward. It was not long after that night that the dancer she had replaced did not return. Whispers spread among the company, of illness, of scandal, of departure, but Ida paid them little mind. The director looked at her during rehearsal, his face unreadable, and simply said, "The role is yours now." The words fell into her like a stone into water, sinking deep, sending out ripples that she felt in every corner of her being. She did not thank him. He did not expect her to. Instead, she stood at the center of the stage and let the weight of those words settle. The days began to blur. She would rise in the mornings to the quiet routine of her guardian's house, each hour of that life now feeling like a distant echo. In the evenings, she became someone else, not yet famous, not yet scandalous, but already unbound. Her body grew stronger, her movements sharper, her silences heavier with meaning. There was a moment, late in a rehearsal when the pianist struck the first notes of the dance, when she felt something open in her, wide and luminous. She understood then that the stage was not merely a place for performance. It was the one place in the world where she could shed the language others had written for her. Every gesture, every breath was hers alone. And yet, in that same moment of clarity, she felt something else stir in the air, something she could not yet name. Not all who watched would understand her dance as she did. Some would praise, others would condemn. To dance at the edge of what society allowed was to court both devotion and fury. But Ida did not look away from that truth. She welcomed it like a flame cupped in her palms. Rehearsals soon ceased to be rehearsals. They became something closer to a quiet storm gathering its own rhythm. The company, once merely a collection of faces around her, began to sense the gravity she carried. They moved differently when she was on the stage, not because she demanded it with words, but because something in the way she filled the space required it. It was not skill alone. Many were more technically precise, more trained, more practiced, but she carried a force they could not mimic, the force of someone who had never been given the language to express herself and now had discovered that movement could do what words never could. She did not dance for their approval. She danced as if it was the only way to keep breathing. The director's eyes followed her with that unsettling clarity, the gaze of a man who had seen talent bloom and vanish too many times to speak of it lightly. He did not indulge her, did not praise her openly, but each time he called her name, the others understood what it meant. She had become the center of the piece without asking to be. It was not a role she had pursued through ambition or planning. It was as though the role itself had been waiting for her, and when she arrived, it simply recognized its owner. As the date of the performance drew near, whispers began to escape the walls of the theater. Salome was not a work that could be staged without attention. Its very name carried the scent of transgression. In St. Petersburg's drawing rooms, society spoke of it with fascination and scorn. The idea of a woman performing that role, of embodying both sacredness and desire in the same breath, unsettled the carefully drawn lines of what was permitted. The scandal began even before the curtain would rise. But it was this same scandal that drew people to it. Those who condemned also longed to see, because nothing stirs curiosity more than a boundary about to be broken. Ida, meanwhile, lived in two worlds. In one, she remained the quiet ward of a wealthy family, a young woman of good standing expected to marry and continue the still, unspoken traditions of her class. In the other, she was a figure moving beneath the stage lights, barefoot on worn wood, her hair unbound, her body shedding everything that had ever been expected of it. Each night she crossed the threshold between those worlds more easily until the house that had once contained her began to feel like a fading photograph. Her guardians did not yet know. They believed her exhaustion to be the result of reading, of melancholy, perhaps even of illness. They did not imagine that she spent her nights in a theater, rehearsing a dance that would ignite their society. She watched them speak across the dinner table, their eyes blind to the fire sitting opposite them. It almost made her smile. The costume fittings began in late summer. For the first time, she stood not as a secret replacement, but as the figure at the center of the stage. The seamstresses draped fabric around her, light silks and muted golds and reds, garments designed not to clothe her, but to make her body the language. She stood in silence as they pinned the fabric, the air heavy with the faint smell of chalk and dye. One of the women whispered, almost reverently, "You were born for this role." Ida said nothing. She did not feel born for anything. She felt as though she had chosen it. The director grew more precise, demanding not perfection but intensity. "The dance is not movement," he told her one night, his voice low and close. "It is a wound. If you dance as if it is merely beautiful, they will applaud and forget. But if you dance as if it is your breath, they will not sleep for nights." She understood. She had no wish to be merely beautiful. Beauty had been handed to her all her life, wrapped in silk, displayed like a delicate object. But this was different. This was claiming that beauty and burning it into something no one could own. The night before the premiere, she returned home late, the scent of the theater still clinging to her hair. The city was quiet but not asleep. A wind moved through the streets, lifting stray leaves and the faint smells of smoke and water. She paused at the gate of the house and looked at its windows, tall and dark, the house that had once defined her entire existence. It looked smaller now, not in size but in power. She understood with a clarity that made her breath still, that when she stepped onto that stage the next night, she would no longer belong to it, and it would no longer hold her. She slept little, not from fear, but from the slow, steady weight of knowing she was on the edge of something she could not return from. She rose before dawn and stood at her window, her bare feet cold against the floorboards. Outside, the early fog moved like soft fabric through the trees. She pressed her palm against the glass and whispered no prayer. She had none to give. She was not waiting to be saved. She was ready to claim. The day passed like a held breath. The theater buzzed with an energy that even the stagehands could not quiet. Costumes hung like expectant shadows. The orchestra murmured in low tones. In the dressing room, the mirror reflected her face, calm, almost unnaturally so. The other dancers chattered nervously, their laughter sharp with excitement. She remained silent, her hands resting on her knees. When the director came to her, he said nothing. He simply placed a hand on her shoulder and left. As the lights dimmed and the audience settled, the murmurs from beyond the curtain grew into a low, humming tide. She could feel their curiosity, their judgment, their hunger. Many had come not to celebrate, but to watch the scandal unfold. Their eyes were already writing the headlines. She knew this. She felt it. And yet, as the first notes of the orchestra filled the air, a profound stillness settled in her. When the curtain rose, she stepped into the light. The air changed. She could feel it in her skin, in the hush that fell like a blade over the room. The dance began slowly, a series of deliberate, almost ceremonial gestures, and then, like breath caught between ribs, it broke open. Her body was no longer simply moving. It was speaking in a language that neither the audience nor the stage itself had expected. Some gasped, some leaned forward, some stiffened in their seats, but none looked away. She gave them no choice. And when the final movement came, that sharp, precise stillness at the heart of the dance, the theater was silent. No applause, not yet. Just the weight of what she had done settling into every corner of the room. Then the wave broke. Some rose to their feet, some whispered, some shouted, but all felt something they could not easily name. And in that storm of sound, Ida stood at the center, calm, almost serene. She had crossed a threshold not just in her own life, but in the way others would see her from this night forward. The night of her performance did not end when the curtain fell. In truth, it began there. The sound of the final applause, uneven, fragmented, charged with both awe and disapproval, followed her like an echo that refused to fade. Even in the cramped dressing room, where the air still held the musk of stage powder and sweat, she could feel the presence of the audience outside, their restless murmurs seeping through the walls. Some had risen to their feet with shining eyes. Others had left in silence, as though unable to reconcile what they had just witnessed with what they believed the stage should permit. It was the kind of reaction she had wanted, though she did not yet fully understand the weight of what she had set in motion. The mirror before her was clouded with the heat of her breath. Her reflection did not look like the young woman who had entered this theater months ago with trembling steps and borrowed courage. The silk costume clung to her skin, still warm from the lights, and a faint trace of her own scent rose beneath the powder and the perfume. She did not feel beautiful, not in the way society defined it. She felt sharpened, as if the dance had carved her into something harder, something that could not be easily contained. Behind her, the other dancers whispered, their voices carrying both admiration and unease. They had watched her transform on stage, and they knew instinctively that the space they had once shared with her would never be quite the same. Outside the theater, the night air was cold and quick. A crowd had gathered, not large but electric in its mood. Men in fur-lined coats spoke in sharp, excited tones. Women in jewels clutched their fans and whispered behind gloved hands. Some called her name with an almost feverish reverence. Others spat it out as though it were a provocation. A name that had once belonged quietly to the halls of a wealthy family was now being carried into the streets like a match held to dry leaves. She slipped through a side door, wrapped in a cloak, not out of shame, but to feel the cold against her skin. The theater behind her glowed like a furnace, alive with a heat that had nothing to do with warmth. She walked quickly through the narrow streets, each step echoing on the damp stones. Somewhere behind her, a coachman called out her name in a broken accent, offering to drive her home, but she shook her head and kept moving. The night seemed different now. The world was not silent as it had been when she first crept through these same streets months earlier. It hummed, restless, as if something invisible had shifted in the city's bones. She realized then that a door had opened, not just for her, but in the minds of those who had seen her. Some would follow her, some would despise her, but none would ever forget. When she entered the house, the hall was dark, the familiar portraits standing guard in their rigid silence. She moved past them, still carrying the rhythm of the stage in her body. In her room, she undressed slowly, each layer of fabric feeling like a barrier she had already outgrown. The sound of applause lingered somewhere in the back of her skull, not as praise but as a strange, distant heartbeat. She lay down without lighting the lamp. She could not sleep. She did not need to. Something had been set in motion that would not stop for rest. The morning brought the consequences. Whispers traveled faster than she had ever imagined. By the time she rose, the newspapers were already filled with feverish lines about the scandal of the night before. Some wrote of her as if she were a creature of danger, a woman who had dared to take a sacred text and turn it into a vessel of sensuality. Others called her brilliant, comparing her to figures she had only ever read about. But beneath the words lay the same pulse, fascination wrapped in judgment. Her guardians were not spared these whispers. Invitations were rescinded from certain salons. Others increased, driven by curiosity to be near the woman whose name now trembled on so many lips. They confronted her not with rage, but with something far colder, disbelief. She had not merely stepped out of their world, she had set it on fire. They spoke of reputation, of disgrace, of the weight of their family's name. But as they spoke, she sat still, her hands resting on her lap, her gaze unwavering. Their voices were like the sound of a distant river now, once powerful, now irrelevant. She had seen what the stage could give, and no amount of family disapproval could take it back. In the weeks that followed, her performance became the city's obsession. Artists, writers, and aristocrats spoke of her in candlelit rooms, their words sliding between reverence and scandal. For some, she was the embodiment of everything decadent and dangerous about modern art, the way it blurred boundaries, stripped away comfort, and forced people to look. For others, she was a revelation, a figure who moved beyond polite convention and dared to make beauty unsettling. She was no longer merely Ida Rubinstein, the girl from a wealthy family. She was Ida Rubinstein, the woman who had turned Salome into a mirror that reflected society's hidden desires and fears. And with that transformation came invitations from outside the city. Letters arrived, inked in elegant hands, bearing the names of foreign directors and impresarios who had heard of the scandal and wanted to see the woman behind it. Paris, they whispered, Berlin, Vienna, the great stages where new art was not merely performed, but born. Each letter was both a promise and a temptation, a widening of the path she had begun to walk the night she first stepped into the theater. But with the praise came resistance too. The church spoke against her performance. Conservative critics accused her of desecration. Anonymous notes arrived at the theater, calling her dangerous, unclean, unwomanly. Yet she read them with an odd, quiet calm. They had not understood that she had long ago ceased needing their approval. If they could not name her without spitting, it only meant she had unsettled them deeply enough to matter. She continued to rehearse, though now the rehearsal space felt changed. The other dancers moved around her as though near a fire that might warm or burn, depending on how close they dared to stand. The director watched her not as an apprentice anymore, but as a force to be reckoned with. The piano sounded different now. Even the floor seemed to carry the memory of her steps. One evening, after another long rehearsal, she walked once again through the city streets, the air warm now with summer. She passed cafes where poets and painters argued over absinthe, their words drifting into the night like sparks. She did not stop. She felt their eyes on her but did not return their gaze. She understood something new now. Scandal was not an end, but a beginning. It was not a cage. It was a stage of its own. And as the wind lifted the edge of her shawl, she smiled faintly. It was not the smile of triumph. It was quieter, deeper. The kind of smile of someone who has finally found the shape of their own shadow and is no longer afraid to stand fully within it. Summer unfolded like a slow exhalation, warm and heady, the city heavy with scents of lilac and damp stone. The scandal of that first performance did not fade. It grew, like ivy creeping over walls, reaching into corners where her name had never been spoken before. What had begun as whispers in drawing rooms turned into fierce debates in salons and cafes, and then into long, indignant columns in the papers, as though the entire city had agreed to hold her name on its tongue. But Ida had already crossed the invisible threshold between the private world of expectation and the wide, unruly territory of public myth. She no longer moved through St. Petersburg as an heiress. She moved as a figure everyone seemed to know, and yet no one could quite define. She learned quickly that scandal, once awakened, has its own appetite. It does not sleep. It feeds on the breath of those who speak its name. She could feel it in the way strangers looked at her when she walked down Nevsky Prospect, the way conversations faltered as she passed, the way glances lingered not with the polite admiration once afforded to a young woman of her station, but with something sharper, more unsettled. Some gazes sought to claim her, to fold her back into the safety of their expectations. Others sought to condemn her, but she no longer belonged to any of them. Letters continued to arrive. At the theater, at her home, even left quietly at the cafe table where she sometimes sat alone. Some were fervent declarations of admiration, written in hurried, elegant hands. Others dripped with anger, veiled threats dressed in the language of morality. There were those who begged to see her dance again and those who demanded that she vanish. She read them all with the same distant curiosity. To matter this much, she thought, is to stand at the center of a storm and not be moved by its winds. Her guardians had grown quiet. The fury of their initial discovery had given way to a kind of stiff, disbelieving silence. They no longer spoke to her of suitors or of family name. Their conversations with her had become careful, brittle things, like porcelain teacups set too close to the edge of a table. She did not meet their silence with apology. She let it hang between them like a drawn curtain. They did not know how to reach her anymore because she was no longer standing in the room where they had left her. She had gone somewhere they could not follow. The theater, once her secret refuge, now became a site of pilgrimage. Artists came to see her rehearse, curious to witness whether the performance that had shocked their city had been accident or intention. She danced differently now, not out of uncertainty or hunger, but with a growing awareness of the power she wielded. She did not confuse power with praise. She understood they were not the same. Praise was fragile, fleeting, and often insincere. Power, however, was quieter. It existed in the stillness of a room when she entered, in the way others leaned forward without meaning to, in the way the director no longer gave her instructions but shared glances of wordless understanding. It was during one of those rehearsals that a tall man with a narrow face and dark coat approached the director after she had finished. He watched her with the kind of gaze that suggested he was measuring not her beauty, though it was undeniable, but something more elusive, the kind of presence that cannot be taught or purchased. He introduced himself with soft, careful words and offered an invitation. A season in Paris, a company known for pushing the limits of what was allowed on the stage, a director whose reputation was both celebrated and feared. Paris. The word seemed to move through the room like a whisper made of gold. She had never been there, but she had imagined it often. A city alive with light and smoke, with art that did not apologize for itself. A place where the theater did not merely exist at the edges of polite society, but stood at its very heart, bold and unashamed. She did not answer immediately, but the seed was planted, and she felt it take root at once. In the weeks that followed, the invitation became less of a question and more of a gravity pulling her forward. The scandal in St. Petersburg, once thrilling in its danger, had begun to feel like a room she had already explored. Its walls were closing in, even as the city continued to whisper her name. She knew instinctively that staying would mean being trapped in the shape they had already carved for her. The scandalous girl who danced once and set tongues wagging. But Paris promised a different kind of fire. On the night before she was to leave, she walked through the city alone. The summer air was heavy and warm, and the river shone faintly beneath the gas lamps. She passed the theater where it had all begun, where she had stood trembling behind the curtain and stepped forward into a world that would not let her retreat. The posters bearing her name were still plastered along the walls, some torn, some freshly pasted, their edges curled by the heat. She stopped in front of one and traced her fingers lightly over the ink, not as a farewell, but as a quiet acknowledgement. This was where she had first been named, but it would not be where she remained. The house was silent when she returned. Her guardians knew she was leaving, though they had not spoken of it. Their faces had the stillness of people who had chosen not to understand what they could not control. She packed little. A few dresses, her shawl, the letters from Paris, and the quiet certainty that she would not return the same. She looked once at the window of her childhood room, the frost long gone, but the memory of it still there, sharp and cold. It felt like a lifetime away, a house she had once lived in but had already left in spirit long before she walked through its door for the last time. The train station in the early morning was a chorus of steam and murmured goodbyes. She wore a simple black coat and no jewels. She had no need to display what could not be contained. When the train began to move, the rhythm of its wheels on the tracks sounded to her like a heartbeat, steady, insistent, alive. She did not look back. St. Petersburg would whisper her name for years, perhaps forever, but its hold on her was gone. As the landscape blurred past the window, she rested her forehead against the cool glass. The horizon stretched wide, filled with places she had never seen, with languages she had not yet spoken, with the weight and lightness of becoming something new. She closed her eyes, and for a brief moment she saw again the stage, the warm glow of the lights, the silence before the first step. But this time, the theater was not in St. Petersburg. It was somewhere far away, somewhere larger, hungrier, ready to devour and adore her in equal measure. Paris awaited her like a door already half open. The train moved steadily westward, its rhythm wrapping itself around her like a slow, insistent pulse. Smoke rose from the engine in long white ribbons, dissolving into the pale morning sky, and each passing mile felt as though it was erasing a layer of the life she had once inhabited. Ida sat by the window, watching the Russian countryside stretch and bend into shapes she would not see again. The birches thinned, the horizon widened, and as the train passed through towns and fields, she felt no sorrow in leaving. If anything, there was a kind of quiet clarity in the movement itself, as if her life had been holding its breath all these years and had only now exhaled. Paris was a name she had heard whispered with equal parts longing and disapproval since she was a child. To some, it was the city of dangerous ideas, of art that shook the pillars of society. To others, it was a shimmering beacon where beauty and daring danced together without apology. For Ida, it had always been a kind of myth, something distant and golden, like the faint sound of music drifting from a room one was never allowed to enter. As the train approached the border, she realized with a strange stillness that she was no longer listening from the hallway. She was about to step inside. The city greeted her not with ceremony, but with noise, layered, restless, alive. The smoke from the station curled into the air like a physical echo of the energy that pulsed through the streets. Paris did not look like St. Petersburg. It moved differently, with a looseness that defied the rigid geometry of her childhood world. The air smelled of bread, rain, and perfume. Carriages clattered against cobblestones. Women walked without the practiced stillness of aristocratic restraint. Men argued openly on street corners, and music leaked through half-open windows as if the city itself was an instrument. It was overwhelming, but it was not foreign. It felt in a way that she could not yet name, like a place she had always been moving toward. The company that had invited her was waiting. They were not grand in the traditional sense, not draped in imperial elegance or polished with aristocratic manners. Their theater was not a palace, but a cavern of light and shadow, housed in a building that smelled of wood, paint, and the faint sweetness of aging velvet. The director, a man with quick hands and an untidy beard, greeted her without the ritual stiffness she had known all her life. "You are not here to be admired," he told her plainly. "You are here to work." It was not cruelty. It was an invitation into a world where the weight of expectation was measured not in family names, but in breath, movement, and sweat. The first rehearsals were difficult. She had been a sensation in St. Petersburg, but here she was simply another body on the stage, expected to earn her place. The dancers moved with a ferocity she had never encountered before. Their limbs spoke languages she barely understood. Their silences were sharp, their laughter unguarded, their ambition tangible. She stumbled at first, not in her steps, but in the unfamiliarity of a place where no one treated her like something fragile or exceptional. Yet each misstep only deepened her hunger. She learned quickly, her body adapting to the pace, to the air of a theater where boundaries were not respected but broken, where art was not whispered about in salons but lived fiercely in the open. Paris was not merely a stage, it was a breathing organism, and every night its streets filled with artists, poets, composers, dancers, and those who followed them not out of politeness but obsession. Names she had once only seen in books or heard spoken of in hesitant tones were here, moving through cafes and galleries like ordinary shadows. She saw painters whose canvases shocked the polite world, heard poets whose verses cut through air like knives, and watched dancers who did not care whether they were loved or despised. In this city, scandal was not a mark of shame. It was often a crown. For the first time in her life, Ida moved through a world where she did not have to explain her defiance. No one asked why she danced as she did. No one warned her to be careful of appearances. No one told her to speak softly. Here, intensity was a language, and she spoke it fluently. She began to spend her nights not only on stage, but in smoky rooms where the air was thick with absinthe and arguments. She listened more than she spoke, absorbing the city like a scent that would never leave her clothes. Her performances began to draw attention almost immediately, not because she was flawless, but because she carried the same quality she had once brought to St. Petersburg, the unsettling, magnetic stillness that existed just before a storm breaks. Critics tried to define it and failed. Some called her dancing spiritual, others called it indecent, but all agreed that no one could look away. In Paris, this quality did not isolate her as it had in Russia. It drew others toward her. Among those who watched her with particular interest were the composers and choreographers who saw not just a dancer, but a vessel for something larger. She met Sergei Diaghilev at a gathering that smelled of tobacco and spilt wine, his voice both soft and commanding, his eyes sharp with the hunger of a man who collected brilliance like rare stones. He saw in her not just beauty, but the rare courage to step outside the expected. When he spoke to her of a vision, of a new kind of ballet, something neither polite nor tame, something that would startle the old world awake, she listened, not as a star, but as someone who had been waiting for such a call all her life. It was with Ballets Russes that she would step onto a different kind of stage, a stage not meant for pleasing audiences, but for shaking them. She did not hesitate. She said yes, and in doing so, aligned herself with the very current of artistic rebellion that defined the city at that moment. The rehearsals for their first performance together were like nothing she had ever experienced. They stripped away what she had learned, demanding that she move not as a woman trained, but as a creature, remembering how to breathe. She learned to let silence hang longer, to make each movement not a decoration, but a declaration. She learned to stand at the edge of the light and still command a room. And as she danced, she felt something within her shift from hunger to power. Paris did not whisper about her. It roared. Her name was spoken not just in theaters, but in cafes, in salons where painters argued with poets, in private rooms where those with influence debated whether to embrace or ban what they could not ignore. Some called her dangerous. Others called her divine. But in the end, their words only fed the fire. One evening, after a performance that left the audience silent for a long breath before the applause rose like a tide, she stood alone on the empty stage, the lights dimmed, the velvet curtain still trembling from where it had closed. She pressed her hand to the wooden floor. It was warm beneath her palm, as though the stage itself had a pulse. She thought of St. Petersburg, of the frost on the window, of the shawl hidden beneath her mattress. She had walked so far from that silence that it felt like another lifetime. Yet even in this city of movement, she understood something clearly. This was not the end of her rebellion. It was only its second act. The world around her began to move at a new velocity. Paris was a city that did not sleep in the way St. Petersburg had. It pulsed through the night like a restless creature, feeding on light and sound and the fragile boundaries that art existed to break. As autumn settled in and the air grew crisp with the faint scent of chestnuts and smoke, Ida found herself living in a rhythm that felt less like a schedule and more like a current. Days blurred into rehearsals, nights into performances, and between the two lay a thin corridor of hours spent in cafes where ideas were flung through the air like sparks from flint. Her name had become not merely known, but charged, spoken not just with admiration, but with that dangerous combination of reverence and unease that belongs only to figures who refuse to be contained. The company of Ballets Russes had no interest in pleasing. Under Sergei Diaghilev's restless eye, they built performances that made beauty ache and elegance crack open to reveal something sharper beneath. Ida fit into this world not like a guest, but like a necessary element, as if the company had been waiting for someone who carried scandal not as a wound, but as a kind of quiet weapon. Her dancing was never about refinement. It was about possession, about stepping into the center of a stage and making the air itself bend to her. Paris responded in its usual way, half in awe, half in outrage. The critics could not agree on what she was. Some called her ethereal, others called her indecent, and still others called her something they could not yet define. And perhaps that was what unsettled them most. She refused to be translated into the language they knew. When she performed, there was no polite boundary between sacred and profane, between reverence and rebellion. She blurred those lines until they ceased to exist, until the stage itself became an unholy, luminous space where the audience was forced to see themselves differently. The city wrapped itself around her like a living cloak. Wherever she went, eyes followed. But unlike the cautious attention of St. Petersburg, these gazes were more dangerous. Here, admiration was fierce, obsession unhidden. Artists came to her dressing room after performances, their voices low, their eyes feverish with the intoxication of being near something that felt both fragile and invincible. Patrons sent extravagant gifts, draped not just in silk and gold but in expectation. Writers slipped folded notes into her hands, declaring that she had changed something in them, though they could not say what. And always behind this adoration, there was the soft hiss of envy, of those who saw her rise and knew they could not stop it. She learned quickly to move through it like mist. She accepted the flowers, the invitations, the praise, but she let none of it cling to her. She understood instinctively that the adoration of a crowd was as fickle as the wind, and that what had lifted her up could just as easily turn cold. Her power lay not in their affection, but in the way she made them feel. The way she carved a silence into their throats, the way her movements lingered in their minds long after the curtain fell. But it was not only audiences she unsettled. Behind the curtain, among the dancers and choreographers, she became a force that reoriented the orbit of the company. She was neither beloved nor resented in any simple way. She inspired, intimidated, and attracted in equal measure. Her presence shifted hierarchies, bending invisible structures like heat warps glass. Some whispered that she was dangerous to the balance of the troupe. Others said she was its heart. Diaghilev himself watched her with a strange mix of calculation and awe, as though he had discovered a creature both wild and essential to his grand vision. At night, when the streets of Paris glowed with the faint yellow of gas lamps, she often walked alone. Fame, as intoxicating as it was, came with a kind of stillness that others did not see. She could feel it in the moments after a performance, when the applause faded and the theater emptied. The silence that followed was vast, like a dark lake into which all sound dissolved. She would step out into the street, the scent of grease paint still clinging to her hair, and walk past the cafes where laughter spilled like wine. Sometimes she would pause on the bridges over the Seine, watching the water turn the city's light into fractured gold. She felt both powerful and terribly alone, as if she belonged to no world but the one that existed between stage lights and shadow. It was during one of these late walks that she first encountered the group of composers who would later shape some of her most unforgettable performances. They sat outside a cafe, their table cluttered with half-drunk glasses and cigarette smoke swirling in loose halos. One of them, a young man with hair like a dark river, called out to her in accented French, not with reverence but with the familiarity of someone speaking to a myth he already believed in. She stopped, not because of what he said, but because of how he said it. Without fear, without awe, as if he knew that beneath the public storm of her name, she was still a person moving through a city at night. They spoke for hours, about music, about movement, about how a performance could be both a wound and a gift. She listened more than she spoke, as she always did, but her silences carried the weight of someone who understood instinctively what others spent years trying to name. When they parted, one of the composers promised her that he would write something for her, something that no one else could dance. She did not ask for details. She only nodded, feeling in the quiet of that moment how easily art and danger entwine themselves when left alone in the dark. The weeks that followed wove her deeper into the fabric of the city's artistic rebellion. She became more than a dancer. She became a symbol, a kind of figure artists used to test the edges of what was permissible. Painters sketched her without asking permission. Writers used her as the ghost that haunted their stories. Composers imagined her steps before she had taken them. It was both a gift and a theft. To be seen this way was to be both magnified and stripped, and yet she did not resist it. She understood the transaction. She had long ago learned that to command the stage was to surrender pieces of oneself to those who watched. But there were moments, quiet and unguarded, when she missed the anonymity of that first night she had crept through the snow to a small, unknown theater. Fame had its own kind of silence, one that pressed at the edges of her solitude. In those moments, she returned to the rehearsal rooms long after everyone else had left. She would stand alone on the empty stage, barefoot, the floor cold beneath her skin, and dance without music. Not for audiences, not for critics or directors or lovers, but for the invisible self she carried like a secret ember. One night, Diaghilev found her there. He said nothing, only watched from the shadows as she moved with a softness that no one else ever saw. When she finished, she turned and met his gaze without surprise. He did not praise her. He only said quietly, "This is why they will never forget you." Then he left, his footsteps fading into the silence. She stood in the dark long after he was gone. The city outside was loud, full of voices and smoke, and the endless churn of names rising and falling like tides. But inside the theater, in that deep and private quiet, she felt something rare. Not applause, not desire, not even power, but a stillness that belonged only to her. The years that followed were not measured by the calendar, but by the rhythm of performances, each one another stitch in the fabric of her legend. Paris had not simply welcomed her, it had devoured and absorbed her into its pulse. She had become part of the city's breath, its night air, its theater smoke, and whispered obsessions. When she entered a room now, conversations faltered not out of politeness, but from that strange electricity that lingers around those who are no longer entirely flesh and blood, but something larger, harder to grasp. Ida had become both woman and myth, both performer and symbol. She carried herself with the calm assurance of one who had stopped asking permission long ago. This growing presence did not happen in sudden leaps. It grew the way ivy climbs a wall, slowly, persistently, until one day the wall itself is no longer visible beneath it. Her collaborations expanded beyond the company that had first given her a Parisian stage. Painters wanted to capture her. Writers sought to turn her movements into sentences. And composers began to build entire worlds around her. They saw in her not just a dancer, but a figure through whom their most dangerous ideas could move. One evening, after a particularly charged performance, she was introduced to a slender man with sharp eyes that seemed always to be listening. His name was Maurice Ravel. He did not speak to her as others did, with the tremor of awe or the sly calculation of men who desired to attach their names to hers. He spoke simply, almost clinically, about rhythm, about precision, about the way a single movement could carry the weight of an entire composition. Their first conversation was not about her or him, but about the nature of repetition, how a sound or gesture, when returned to again and again, stops being decoration and becomes a pulse, a kind of inevitability. It was not the language of flattery, but of creation. In that quiet, intense way of his, he proposed something not as a gift, but as a challenge, a work that would be built like a slow, inexorable wave, rising not through melody, but through relentless rhythm. She listened as he spoke, her head tilted slightly, the corners of her mouth not smiling but alive with thought. She did not need to be convinced. She simply said, "Yes." The idea that would become Bolero began in silence, Ravel wrote, and she moved alone in the dim rehearsal room long before any musician ever touched an instrument. There was nothing to follow at first, but the imagined pulse of a piece not yet born. Night after night, she stood barefoot on the wooden floor, repeating small gestures over and over. A turn of the wrist, the sweep of a hip, the slow, deliberate tilt of her head. She learned to surrender to the simplicity of it, to the unbearable patience of something that does not hurry to reveal itself. Others might have found such repetition maddening. For Ida, it was something else entirely. It was as if each movement carved away a layer of everything she had been told she should be. When the musicians finally entered the room for the first joint rehearsal, the air shifted. The opening drum beat, soft but steady, slid beneath her skin like something ancient and familiar. There were no sudden crescendos to hide behind, no storm of notes to cover the vulnerability of stillness. The music built slowly, insistently, like breath gathering in a chest, and she matched it, not with the grand flourishes expected of prima ballerinas, but with movements so restrained they seemed at first like whispers. But whispers, when repeated long enough, can become thunder. She understood this instinctively. The premiere of Bolero was unlike any other performance she had ever given. The stage was stripped bare. There were no elaborate sets, no distractions, only the steady pulse of Ravel's composition, the steady widening of sound and her body, a single figure in the center of the growing storm. The audience arrived expecting spectacle. What they received was something far more dangerous: inevitability. As the rhythm grew louder, her movements did not grow grander. They tightened, sharpened, became something both mechanical and sensual. It was a dance of control, not frenzy. At first, the crowd did not know what to make of it, but as the music built and built, a strange unease settled over the theater, followed by a feverish attention. She was no longer simply performing. She was binding them to the rhythm, forcing them to feel its grip the way she did. By the time the final note came, it was not applause that filled the room, but a stunned silence. A silence so thick it felt like a second skin. And then the sound broke. It came like a flood, wild and loud and conflicted. Some cheered as though they had been set free. Others hissed, disturbed by what they had witnessed. It was perfect. Ravel, backstage, watched her with the distant half-smile of someone who knows he has made something that will outlive both its creator and its interpreter. She did not smile back. She stood still, her breath shallow, as though the last echo of the drum beat still lived in her spine. This was not a performance that belonged to applause. It was a performance that had consumed her entirely, and she knew, with the kind of certainty that settles like a stone at the bottom of a river, that the world would not forget it. The newspapers in the days that followed were loud and divided. Some called her performance genius. Others called it grotesque. Some praised the simplicity of the choreography as revolutionary. Others accused her of stripping art of its soul and leaving only a relentless, pagan pulse. But no one, not even the harshest critic, called it forgettable. Bolero had burned itself into the collective memory of the city, and her name was now inseparable from its rhythm. For Ida, something subtle shifted after that night. It was not the scale of her fame, that had already long since grown beyond control, but the way she carried it. She no longer walked as someone defying expectation. She walked as someone who had outlived it. In salons and theaters, she was no longer merely a dancer or a scandal. She had become a reference point. People began to speak of her in the same way they spoke of storms, not as something to judge, but as something that happens, something that changes the landscape simply by existing. Yet in the quiet after each performance, in the moments when the lights dimmed and the world went silent, she returned to the solitude that had always been her truest companion. No amount of applause or scandal could erase the fact that at the core of everything was a single figure standing alone in the dark, listening to the sound of her own breath. And it was there, in that fragile, private stillness, that she recognized what she had become. Not just a performer, but a force that had learned to move entire rooms without ever asking permission. The months after the premiere of Bolero carried with them a strange, weightless momentum, as if the rhythm of that single drumbeat had stretched itself beyond the stage and threaded itself through every corner of her existence. Wherever she went, that night seemed to follow. Not as a single performance, but as a myth retold in fragments, reshaped by every tongue that spoke of it. Some recalled her as a living flame, others as a figure of terrifying restraint, and still others as a woman who had stripped art bare of its polite disguises. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in the space between their words and her silence. She had learned long ago that legends are not built from facts. They are built from echoes. Paris, which had already been her accomplice, seemed to bend even more around her presence. The cafes grew louder when her name was mentioned. Critics argued as though defending or denouncing a national monument, and young dancers imitated the tilt of her head, the curve of her wrist, the measured way she allowed stillness to dominate motion. She had become a kind of axis in the artistic world. Not universally loved, not even universally understood, but impossible to ignore. Even those who despised her had to name her. And that, she knew, was a kind of power more enduring than applause. Yet the weight of such power was not light. It settled on her shoulders like an invisible cloak. At first, she had carried fame with the fierce detachment of someone who had walked through fire and found herself unburned. But now it began to whisper to her differently. Fame, she discovered, is not a still thing. It grows, twists, demands. It is never content to sit quietly in the corner. It wants to follow you into every room, to turn even your solitude into a stage. There were nights when she longed for anonymity the way one longs for air after being underwater too long. She missed the cold of St. Petersburg winters, the attic where no one watched, the quiet that had once been a companion instead of a luxury. She began to withdraw in small, almost imperceptible ways. After performances, when others lingered to be seen, she slipped away. She stopped attending the endless dinners and salons that circled around her like moths to a flame. When she walked through the city now, she chose the quieter streets, wrapped herself in shawls that made her less visible. She still danced, still commanded the stage as no one else could, but the world beyond the theater began to feel like a storm she no longer wished to step into. This quietness did not go unnoticed. In the world of Paris, absence is never neutral. The whispers began again, but softer this time, like footsteps in an empty hallway. Some said she had grown arrogant. Others said she had grown weary. Some imagined great tragedies behind her retreat, because people who live through others' imaginations can never simply be tired. They must always be a story. But she gave them nothing to confirm or deny their fictions. She moved through her days with the same silence that had once defined her childhood, a silence that no longer came from confinement, but from choice. And yet, in the middle of this deliberate retreat, she continued to create. It was during this quieter season of her life that she began to use her fortune in ways that startled those who thought they understood her. Ida had always been seen as a performer, But few realized she had also been watching, carefully, closely, the way one watches the shifting of light on water. She understood the fragility of art, how easily brilliance could be crushed under the weight of patronage that demanded obedience. She had lived her entire life rebelling against such cages, so she became a different kind of patron, one who offered not control but freedom. Painters struggling to find walls that would hold their work, poets too bold for publishers, musicians whose compositions unsettled polite society. These were the people she began to support quietly, her name often hidden behind the gold she gave. She did not demand that they thank her. She did not ask for dedications. She only asked that they not tame their work to make others comfortable. In a city that loved to consume artists but rarely cared to protect them, she became, almost without meaning to, a silent guardian of rebellion. It was during these years that she also returned to works of her own choosing. Not the grand performances that filled the newspapers, but smaller pieces, intimate productions staged in dimly lit theaters where the air felt closer, where the audience sat so near they could hear her breath. These performances were not meant to please, they were meant to linger. There was something in the way she moved during those nights, slower, sharper, stripped of all adornment, that spoke of a woman who no longer needed to prove anything. Those who witnessed them often left the theater unable to explain what they had seen. It was as if they had glimpsed something private. The city continued to speak of her loudly, but she had grown quieter. Fame shouted around her, and she answered with silence. It was not surrender. It was something deeper, a refusal to let the noise drown her own pulse. One evening, she returned to the theater long after the last lights had been extinguished. The stage was cold and smelled faintly of dust, the way old velvet does when it has absorbed too many seasons. She walked to the center and stood in the dark. For a long time, she didn't move. She let the silence settle like a second skin. And then, almost without thought, she lifted her arms and began to dance. No music, no lights, no audience. Only the creak of the wooden boards beneath her feet and the soft rhythm of her breath. It was in that moment, not on opening nights, not beneath the gaze of critics or admirers, that she felt the closest to the girl she had once been, the one who had stood at a frosted window in St. Petersburg, pressing her palm against the glass and imagining a stage she had never seen. So much had happened between that frozen night and this quiet hour. Scandal, fame, fire, rhythm. But beneath it all, something remained unchanged. The way the world vanished when she moved, and only the movement remained. She understood then that this was the only real possession she had ever had. Not the applause, not the praise, not even the myth they had built around her. Only this, the dance itself, unbound, untamed, belonging to no one. Outside, the city still murmured her name. But here, on the empty stage, there was only the whisper of her breath and the sound of wood remembering her footsteps. Autumn folded slowly into winter again, but it was not the kind of winter Ida had known as a child behind the frosted windows of St. Petersburg. This was a Parisian winter, softer around the edges, where the cold carried the faint scent of smoke and bread, where the streets glistened under lamplight rather than disappearing into silence. She was no longer the girl pressing her palm against the glass, dreaming of another world. She had crossed into that other world and shaped it to her breath. The stage was hers now, but more than that, she had become something that lived beyond it, a name that moved through the city like a current, invisible yet undeniable. The world around her was restless. The politics of Europe shifted like wind around an old house, leaking through cracks whether one wished to feel it or not. Artists spoke in hurried whispers in cafes, and newspapers carried the scent of distant unrest between their pages. There were revolutions brewing in places she had only passed through on trains, rumors of the fragile peace fraying at the edges. Even in Paris, a city that tried so hard to pretend it belonged only to art and pleasure. A faint tension, lingered beneath the glittering surface. It did not come as a shout. It came as a low hum, steady and insistent. And though she rarely spoke of it, Ida felt it. Her performances continued, but something in her presence had grown quieter, sharper, as if she were moving with a kind of foreknowledge, as if she understood that everything grand and fragile must one day be touched by what lies beyond the theater. The applause still came, of course, in great waves that washed over her, but she no longer allowed it to linger. It was like rain on marble, felt, then gone. Fame had lost its heat. She no longer needed to conquer the world. She only needed to inhabit it on her own terms. She spent more and more time away from the salons and the gatherings where artists tried to turn their names into monuments. Instead, she began to travel quietly between Paris and other cities, Rome, London, Vienna. Her fortune allowed her to move as she pleased, and she used it not to build palaces, but to build spaces for others. She funded small theaters and dance schools, places where artists who had no access to grand stages could create without asking permission. It was not charity, it was recognition. She understood, perhaps more deeply than most, what it meant to stand outside of the world you were expected to belong to. But even as she moved through Europe with the detachment of a figure both seen and unseen, the shadow of war grew longer. People spoke of it less openly at first, as though keeping their voices low might keep it at bay. Then came the louder reports, the mobilizations, the slow unraveling of certainties. Ida felt no great patriotic fervor. She was not a creature of flags or nations, but she felt the chill of what was coming settle into her bones like an old, unwelcome memory. Art, for all its brilliance, cannot remain untouched when the world begins to fracture. She made a choice then, quiet but deliberate. She would not become a symbol of tragedy. She would not let her name be tied to some glittering echo of a world that was crumbling. Instead, she would make her absence a kind of resistance. She stepped back from the stages that had once been hers, not out of fear, but out of refusal. She had built her life by crossing boundaries. Now she crossed a different one, moving out of the glare and into the shadowed periphery where she could move freely again. But leaving the stage, even temporarily, was not a retreat from the world. In those years, she gave quietly, sending funds where they were needed, supporting hospitals and refugee efforts without allowing her name to be spoken. She had always lived in defiance of expectation. Now that defiance simply wore a different face. For the first time in her adult life, she existed outside of spectacle. There was something strangely gentle in that. The gossip columns, of course, had their own story. They wrote of her vanishing as if it were a scandal in itself, as though a woman could not simply choose to step away without giving the world a reason. Some imagined heartbreak, others ruin, still others a mysterious illness that had taken away the famous dancer's fire. She let them speak. They had been speaking for years, weaving myths around her name, giving her shapes she had never asked for. She no longer cared to correct them. The truest parts of her life had always happened in silence. In a small house outside the city, far from the crowded boulevards, she found something like the quiet she had once longed for as a child. The walls did not echo with applause. The air did not smell of grease paint or perfume. Instead, there was wood smoke, wet soil, and the soft creak of floors that belonged only to her footsteps. She still danced at night when the house was dark, not with the force she once carried onto grand stages, but with the smaller, more personal movements of someone who knows they owe their gift to no one but themselves. It was in these solitary dances that she began to understand something she'd never quite dared to name. She did not need to be seen to exist. The world had once been a mirror she pushed against. Now it was only air, and she moved through it freely. When friends visited her, they sometimes tried to convince her to return, to the stage, to the glare, to the pulse of the city that had once belonged to her. She listened with the patience of someone who knew they were speaking not of her, but of their own need to keep her where they had placed her in their minds. She never argued. She only smiled faintly and poured more tea. They did not understand that she was not waiting for a return. She had arrived somewhere else entirely. And yet, even in her quiet, her name did not fade. It continued to move through the world on its own, detached from her, kept alive by memories, by the way a movement once seen does not easily leave the body of the one who witnessed it. She did not need to feed the myth. It had learned to feed itself. The winter deepened. The world beyond her quiet house grew colder and more uncertain. But in the stillness of those nights when she stood alone and the faint crackle of the fire was the only sound, she felt not fear, not loss, but something close to peace. She had spent her youth running towards something, her middle years standing in the heart of its fire. Now she simply stood, and it was enough. The seasons passed not with the rush of performance calendars and the loud urgency of opening nights, but with the quiet turn of the wind, the way light shifted on wooden floors in her house beyond Paris. In those years, Ida lived not as a figure on a stage, but as a woman learning the weight and texture of stillness. The world beyond her door grew noisier, harsher, shaped by wars and collapsing empires, by the echo of boots on cobblestones and voices that rose not in applause but in rage. Yet within her chosen silence, she cultivated something rare, a life that no longer required an audience to affirm its existence. She was no longer fleeing expectation, nor was she performing defiance. She was simply living in the long shadow of her own legend. The letters continued to find her even in her retreat. Some came from young dancers who spoke of seeing her on stage years earlier, of how her movements had changed the way they understood their own bodies. Some came from patrons and impresarios, urging her to return, promising new productions, grander stages, international tours. Others came from old friends in the arts, written in the restrained hand of those who understood what it means to grow quiet. She replied to few of them, not out of indifference, but because words often felt too small to hold what she had become. She had learned through years of movement that not everything worth carrying forward could be translated into language. The war crept closer, not as a single moment, but as an accumulation of small, uneasy shifts. A headline here, a ration there, soldiers passing through towns with faces that belonged more to exhaustion than to glory. Paris was no longer the fevered, shimmering city of her youth. The absinthe-soaked nights of poets and composers had given way to shadows and curfews. The theaters, once bursting with scandal and light, now held their breath between performances, aware that the world's hunger had turned elsewhere. In that landscape, her withdrawal no longer seemed a scandal. It seemed, to those who knew her, almost prophetic. She did not abandon the world. She merely refused to stand at the center of it. With the quiet means her wealth afforded, she supported hospitals, relief efforts, and struggling artists who had lost their stages to the war. She did it without fanfare, without allowing her name to be spoken. If once she had drawn the eyes of thousands to her every gesture, she now chose to be the invisible hand that kept others moving. There was a strange freedom in that. A freedom she had never known at the height of her fame, when every breath she took seemed to belong to someone else. Yet even in her quiet exile, the body she had trained to speak without words could not remain entirely still. On winter nights, when the world seemed brittle with frost and silence lay heavy upon the countryside, she would clear a small space in her house and dance. It was not the bolero she had carried through theaters, nor the scandalous Salome of her youth, but a slower, more private language. Movements so quiet they barely disturbed the air, as if she were listening to something inside her rather than performing for something outside. In those moments she felt again the certainty that had guided her life, that art was never about the eyes that watched, but about the pulse that drives one to move. It was during one of these quiet winters that a small group of younger dancers came to visit her, having sought her out with the stubborn reverence of those who refuse to believe their idols are allowed to disappear. They expected the figure from the stories, the fire, the scandal, the sharp-edged beauty that had silenced audiences. Instead, they found a woman in a wool shawl, her hair streaked with the first touches of silver, her hands steady. She did not give them a grand speech. She simply watched them dance, the way she herself had once danced in a cold attic under moonlight, when everything was still unknown. And then, without ceremony, she stood and joined them, moving as she always had, with that strange and unsettling calm that could fill a room even without an orchestra. They never forgot that evening, not because she lectured them, not because she performed for them, but because she made the air change with so little effort. They left with the quiet understanding that the legend they had chased was not something separate from the woman. It was the stillness she carried with her, the flame that had never needed to burn loudly to be real. Outside, the war thickened like smoke, but her house remained a place apart, not untouched, for no place could be untouched, but unclaimed. In a world turning toward darkness, she had built a sanctuary where no banners hung, where no ideology was spoken, only breath and movement. It was not resistance in the grand public sense, but it was resistance all the same. In those years, the myth of Ida Rubinstein grew even as she ceased to feed it. The newspapers wrote of her less often, but her name carried the weight of a story that had already taken root in the imagination of a generation. She became a figure spoken of in the same breath as other symbols of an era that was vanishing, the last flickers of a decadent, dangerous, luminous age. Her absence, far from erasing her, only deepened the space she occupied in memory. Sometimes, late at night, when the fire was nearly out and the only light in the house came from a single flickering flame, she thought of the girl she had once been. She saw her clearly. The child in silk sheets beneath a winter sky, the young woman stepping into the theater for the first time, the figure behind the velvet curtain waiting for the drumbeat to begin. She did not feel regret. She did not feel triumph either. She felt only the quiet understanding of someone who had walked through every boundary set before her and found, on the other side, not glory, but stillness. And that, she thought, was a kind of freedom no stage could give. The last years of the war came with a kind of heaviness that settled not just on cities, but inside people themselves. Paris, once so radiant and feverish, grew subdued beneath the weight of occupation and the silent calculations of survival. Cafes where poets and dancers once argued over nothing now held their breath. Theaters dimmed their lights. Stages stood empty or offered only the safest of performances, and the streets were threaded with shadows that did not belong to lamps. The world had been rearranged, and in that rearrangement, Ida found herself further away from the center of it than she had ever been. It was not exile in the usual sense, but something quieter and more deliberate. A stepping aside from the noise of a world tearing itself apart. She spent those years in Vence, in the south of France, far from the city that had once been her stage. The landscape there was softer, the air filled with the scent of sun-warmed earth and olive trees, the light pale and golden even in winter. It was a place where the sound of war arrived only as a distant echo, like thunder rolling far away across unseen hills. She had chosen it not because she wished to hide, but because she needed a place where silence could still exist without being broken by the sound of boots or bombs. Here, her name was less of a myth and more of a whisper, carried only occasionally by those who remembered. Her days unfolded with the precision and slowness of ritual. She rose early when the sky was the pale color of paper and walked through the garden that surrounded her house. The olive branches shifted gently in the wind, and sometimes, when the world seemed unbearably still, she would catch the faint call of birds returning from wherever they had fled. The air smelled of the sea, though it lay some distance away, and of herbs that clung stubbornly to the stones along the path. It was a different rhythm than the one that had once governed her. No rehearsals, no opening nights, no impatient crowds, just the sound of her own footsteps. The few who visited her during this time spoke of how unchanged she seemed, even as the world aged violently around them. There were lines on her face now, hair silvering at the temples, but it was not the silver of someone who had been diminished. It was the silver of someone who had seen too much to be moved easily anymore. She did not speak of the past in the way people often do when their lives are behind them. She did not recount stories of stages and scandals as though they were trophies. She simply carried them inside her, like smooth stones collected over a lifetime of walking through rivers. Sometimes, in the late afternoon, she would dance in the courtyard. It was not the bold, shattering movement of the stages she had once commanded. It was slower, quieter, the kind of dance that exists only between a body and the wind. She did not wear costumes anymore. She danced barefoot, her skirts brushing against the stone, her hands tracing invisible patterns in the air. Those who happened to see her at such moments, a gardener, a friend, a neighbor passing the gate, spoke later of a strange stillness that surrounded her, the same kind of stillness that had filled great theaters when thousands had watched her breathe before moving. It was as though the years had stripped away everything except the essential pulse of her art. The war did not pass her by entirely. No one was untouched. There were shortages, restrictions, moments when the distant thunder grew closer. Yet she remained largely unseen by the machinery of it all. Perhaps because she had stepped so completely out of the spotlight, she moved through those years like a shadow, present, breathing, but not claimed. When she sent money to help those who needed it, she did so through quiet channels. When she sheltered people, as she sometimes did, no one spoke of it. She did not act for history to remember her. She acted because it was what needed to be done. It was also during this time that she encountered her own past in unexpected ways. Newspapers carried fragments of stories about her performances, half remembered by those who had once written with heat and fury. They spoke of her as though she were already a figure from another century, as though her name belonged more to the golden age of Paris than to the war-darkened present. She read these fragments occasionally, then set them aside with neither pride nor bitterness. She understood what they did not, that the myth they spoke of was not her, not fully. It was something she had set in motion years ago, something that had learned to live without her. At night, when the wind carried the faint scent of the sea and the cicadas had gone quiet, she sometimes sat alone by the open window and listened to the stillness. She thought not of the great scandals, not of the wild applause, not of the way cities had burned her name into their walls. She thought instead of a candle flickering in a cold room in St. Petersburg, of the girl she had been then, pressing her palm against the frost and imagining the world beyond it. She thought of how that world had come to her in waves: theater, fame, scandal, Paris, love, loneliness, power, silence. She thought of how, beneath all of it, one thread had never broken: the dance itself. She no longer needed to prove anything, not to the city that had once adored and condemned her in the same breath, not to the audiences who had named her a scandal and a muse, not even to the myth that bore her name. The years had peeled everything away, and what remained was something quieter and infinitely more solid. She had become the thing she had always sought to be: unbound. When the war finally loosened its grip and the world began to breathe again, people emerged from their long shadow, blinking into the light of a new age. Paris began once more to fill its theaters. Names rose and fell. Dancers younger than she had ever been took to the stage with new scandals, new revolutions. Her name surfaced from time to time, spoken softly as a reference point, not as someone to imitate, but as a figure whose existence had made certain freedoms possible. She did not return to the stage. She did not need to. The stage, in its own way, had never really let her go. The last winters of her life were quiet. She walked in her garden, felt the wind in her hair, danced sometimes when no one was watching. She watched the sun set through the olive trees, the light catching on the silver of her hair like it once had on silk. She was no longer the dancer who defied society. She was simply a woman who had lived fully, and on her own terms. The years after the war unfolded like a slow and gentle dusk, not filled with triumph or fanfare, but with the quiet persistence of a world that had been broken and was learning, uneasily, how to live again. The streets of Paris returned to their rhythm, though never quite the same. The cafes opened their doors and filled with the clinking of cups, the low murmur of conversation, the faint aroma of roasted coffee mingling with the damp air. New artists came and went. New scandals were born and forgotten, and the stages she had once set aflame were now occupied by others. Ida watched all of this from a distance, neither nostalgic nor bitter. She understood that art, like breath, is never held by one person for long. It moves on. It must. Her name, though, lingered like the faint trace of perfume on a silk shawl long after the wearer has left the room. It appeared in conversations like a half-remembered melody, mentioned in essays by critics who spoke of a golden age before the war, invoked by young dancers who rehearsed in dusty studios, their sweat mingling with their dreams, their voices repeating her name with reverence and curiosity. For some, she was a legend, for others, an enigma. For a few, she was a myth too large to be entirely believed, and she, living in the South, far from the theaters and the noise, did nothing to shape or correct their stories. Legends once released into the world do not belong to their makers anymore. In Vence, her days were as measured as the light that moved across her garden walls. The mornings belonged to walking. She would rise early, before the sun climbed fully into the sky, and wander the narrow stone paths with a shawl around her shoulders, the scent of rosemary and olive trees thick in the air. She moved slowly now, not because she was weak, but because slowness was the language of her new existence. Her body, once the instrument through which entire cities had gasped and trembled, no longer needed to announce itself. It simply was. Visitors still came, sometimes uninvited, drawn by the idea of the woman who had once brought scandal and wonder to the Parisian stage. They were often young, dancers, writers, musicians, faces lit with the kind of hunger she had once carried herself. They came with questions, with awe, with carefully folded notebooks, hoping she would offer them some hidden key to greatness. But Ida had no interest in being a teacher of formulas. When they asked her about how she created, she often answered with silence, letting the wind move through the courtyard, letting them sit in that silence until they understood that the work could not be taught. It could only be lived. Sometimes, when their persistence softened into humility, she would rise slowly from her chair and step into the center of the courtyard. The sun would fall across the stones, and the wind would lift the hem of her skirt, and she would begin to move, slowly, lightly, the way a shadow shifts against a wall. Her steps were few, her gestures small, but in those brief moments the air would change. Those who watched spoke later of how it felt as though time itself had paused, how something larger than the present had passed through them. She was no longer the woman who had defied society. She was something quieter and more dangerous, a presence that required nothing but breath to exist. She spent long hours reading now, surrounded by stacks of books and fading letters. Some were letters from the past, old notes from friends long gone, composers whose names still echoed in concert halls, artists whose works hung in galleries. She did not keep them as trophies, but as fragments of lives once intertwined with hers. Sometimes she would run her fingers over their faded ink and remember the smell of the rooms in which those words had first been spoken. But these memories did not make her ache. They were simply there, like stones along a riverbed, shaped smooth by time. Evenings were the quietest. The world outside had grown accustomed to noise again, rebuilding, celebrating, shouting. But her house remained as it had always been in her years of retreat, a place where silence was allowed to live without explanation. She would sit by the window, the air cool against her skin, and watch the light fade from the sky. In those hours, she often thought of the strange journey her life had been, from the cold windows of St. Petersburg to the stages of Paris, from the scandalous heat of applause to the solitude of this quiet hillside. There had been fire, there had been thunder, but beneath it all there had always been one thing, the dance itself, waiting like a pulse beneath her ribs. She never married, she never returned to the stage, she never wrote a memoir to explain herself, though many begged her to. She understood what they did not, that the moment one explains too much, the mystery evaporates, and what remains is only fact, brittle and flat. She had never lived for facts. She had lived for the spaces between them. The myth of her life continued to grow in her absence, shaped by those who had never known her. Some said she was reclusive out of regret. Others imagined heartbreak, exile, hidden affairs, secret performances in midnight gardens. She let them imagine what they wished. Myths, she knew, were more faithful than truth. Truth ages and breaks apart under too much light. Myths grow deeper, richer, carried forward by people who need them. And yet beneath all of that, the woman herself remained in her stone house with its slanted light and soft earth. She lived in the stillness that fame can never afford and never forgive. She lived not as a figure to be remembered, but as a presence in the moment. When she stood in her courtyard and let the wind brush against her hands, she felt the same quiet fire she had felt as a child beneath the frost. Not ambition, not rebellion, not triumph. Just that hunger to move. That was what had always been real. She knew her life was winding toward its end. She did not speak of it, but the awareness lived inside her like a well-worn companion. There was no bitterness in it. Only the kind of still acceptance that comes to those who have spent their lives listening closely to silence. She did not fear being forgotten, nor did she crave to be immortal. The world, she understood, forgets almost everything in time, but what matters leaves traces, not in marble or ink, but in the breath of those who come after. She had once set a stage on fire with nothing but the turn of a wrist, the tilt of her head, the slow unfolding of a rhythm. That fire had passed into others long ago. It no longer needed her to burn. Winter returned to the hills above Vents, not as the brutal Russian winters of her childhood, but as a soft, pale veil. The air was cool and dry, carrying with it the faint scent of rosemary and earth. Frost edged the olive branches in the early mornings, dissolving by midday into sun-warmed stone. In these gentle winters, time seemed to loosen its grip on the world, as if the hours themselves were content to drift slowly around her. Ida moved through the season with the quiet steps of someone who no longer measured life by its tempo, but by the way the light changed throughout the day. The world beyond her small home continued to turn, loud and restless, but she no longer turned with it. She had grown old without becoming fragile. Her body was slower, yes, and the long rehearsals of her youth had long since vanished into memory, but there was still a certain precision to her movements. When she reached for a shawl or poured tea, her hands carried the same controlled grace that had once commanded entire theaters. Her body, which had been a vessel for myth and scandal and art, had softened into itself like an instrument no longer played, but still finely tuned. To those who visited her, she seemed almost outside of time, as if the tumult of the century had passed around her, unable to disturb the quiet she had built. Visitors came less frequently now, but when they did, they spoke to her with a reverence that she neither encouraged nor discouraged. They spoke of her performances as though they had witnessed them themselves, even when they had only read about them in yellowed papers or heard them whispered by others. Some brought flowers, some brought questions. She answered little. She had learned that legends are fed more by silence than by confession. A single movement, a glance, an unspoken word could say more than any careful retelling. And besides, she no longer felt the need to explain what had already slipped beyond the reach of language. Her mind moved often through the corridors of her life, not with longing, but with the quiet curiosity of someone rereading an old book without needing to change a single line. She thought of St. Petersburg, of that house that smelled of polished wood and distant silence, of the cold window she had pressed her palm against. She thought of the night she first walked through the snow toward the theater, the way the air had tasted of frost and possibility. She thought of Paris, its fevered nights, its endless arguments, its light spilling over cobblestones like a restless river. She thought of the stage, the drumbeat, the scandal, the weight of 1,000 eyes fixed upon her, and how it had all felt both unbearable and necessary. These memories did not ache. They existed in her like faint stars scattered across a night sky. They did not shine to demand her attention. They simply existed, steady and distant as they always had. Even the most fevered moments of her youth, the storm of applause, the fury of critics, the sweetness of whispered names that belonged only to lovers and shadows, had softened with time. They had become neither triumphs nor regrets. They were simply the shapes that had formed her. On some evenings when the sun had just dipped below the hills and the air turned sharply cold, she would light a single candle in her room. Its flame flickered against the walls in the same way it had so many years ago in her childhood bedroom. She would sit by it, wrapped in a shawl, listening to the silence. Outside, the wind moved gently through the olive trees, and the faint sound of a distant bell carried through the air. In those hours, she did not think of who she had been to the world. She thought only of the simple fact that she had lived fully, with her own hands, her own breath, her own defiance. There was no grand farewell in her mind. She had never needed to make declarations. She knew that when the time came, it would come softly, like everything else in these hills. She was not afraid of death. She had already lived more than one life. The child of privilege, the young rebel slipping through the snow, the dancer who silenced theaters, the scandal that burned through Paris, the patron who moved in quiet shadows, the woman who withdrew without vanishing. Death, she understood, was only another silence, and silence had always been her oldest companion. When she fell ill, it was as gentle as the turning of a page. She did not struggle against it. The world around her narrowed to the walls of her house, to the scent of the garden drifting in through the window, to the soft rustle of the curtains in the winter wind. Those who cared for her did so quietly, aware that this was not a tragedy but a closing of something that had burned brightly and long. One night, when the sky above Vence was clear and pale, she asked for the candle to be lit beside her bed. The flame flickered and cast long shadows across the room, tracing the lines of her face. Her breathing was slow and steady, as if she were listening to something far away. Outside, the wind pressed softly against the shutters, and the night was filled with that strange, wide silence that belongs only to places far from cities. She closed her eyes not with reluctance, but with the kind of ease that comes to someone who has carried her own story to its end. When she died, it was without spectacle, without crowds, without the weight of a watching world. It was quiet, a single breath, a flickering candle, the soft darkness folding over her like a familiar shawl. There were no orchestras, no final performances, no applause. And yet, in a way that no stage could ever contain, it was perfect. It was hers. Word of her passing drifted outward slowly, as if carried on a soft wind. Paris received it like an echo from a distant century. Some wept, Some wrote hurried tributes, some spoke of her with the awe reserved for ghosts. Young dancers who had never seen her in the flesh traced her name in their notebooks as if touching the edge of something sacred. Old critics dug out their fading notes, remembering the shock of the first time she'd stepped onto a stage. Her death, like her life, did not demand reverence. It simply left a space, a quiet absence, like the breath between two movements of music. And in that absence, her myth continued to live, carried not by monuments or marble, but by memory, soft, relentless, and alive. Her absence did not arrive like a sudden break, but like a long exhale, a soft dimming of light. It lingered in the air of the theaters she had once ruled, in the corners of cafes where her name had been spoken with feverish devotion, in the silent breath of younger dancers who still carried her image like a lantern. In Paris, where she had once burned through the polite skin of society, her death was not greeted with the roar of a crowd, but with a quiet ripple, the way the surface of a pond shifts when a single stone sinks beneath. Her myth had lived so loudly that her passing required no thunder. It was already written into the city's bones. The newspapers spoke of her, of course, but not as they once had. Gone were the words of scandal and provocation. They wrote of her now as a figure of an era that felt impossibly distant, though it was not so far. They called her daring. They called her luminous. They called her the dancer who blurred lines, who made silence as dangerous as movement. Even those who had once despised her performances now spoke her name with the cautious reverence reserved for things that have outlived their critics. She had become, in death, what she had always resisted in life, an icon, fixed in memory, immutable. But beneath the words of the papers, beneath the measured tributes, her true legacy moved more quietly. In small dance studios across Europe, where the floors still smelled of chalk and sweat and youth, her name was spoken differently, not as history, but as possibility. Teachers whispered her story to their students, the girl who had left wealth behind, who had stepped through the snow to find a stage, who had turned a single drumbeat into a moment that fractured the air. They did not speak of her death. They spoke of her turning, her stillness, the way she could hold a room without moving at all. And for those young dancers, she was not a ghost, but a kind of permission, a proof that the body could speak louder than the world that tried to contain it. Art changes with time. Movements soften or harden. Names fade, but some remain like stones beneath a river, unseen from the surface, but always shaping the current. Ida's name became one of those stones. Her performances, once so shocking, so divisive, began to be studied with the distant care of historians, choreographers, archivists. They traced her influence not through recordings, for she had left few, but through the echoes she left in others. A hand lifted a certain way, a breath held longer than the music demanded, a silence at the heart of a performance where no silence was written. All of these were her fingerprints, scattered across time. In St. Petersburg, her birthplace, her name returned like a soft wind, too late to touch the world she had fled, but just in time to be remembered as one of its lost daughters. In Paris, the theaters she had once filled welcomed new faces, new scandals, new storms. But behind their velvet curtains, the old stories were still whispered. In Vence, the house where she had spent her final years remained quiet, its courtyard still touched by the same wind that had once lifted the hem of her skirt as she danced alone. There was no shrine, no grand monument, just silence and light. Perhaps that was how she would have wanted it. For all the noise that had surrounded her life, the applause, the outrage, the gossip, the feverish devotion, the essence of her was always something quieter. The scandal had never been in the noise. It had always been in the stillness, in the way she could hold a stage with nothing but breath and intention. People thought they had loved her for her beauty, her daring, her fire. But what they had truly loved, though they did not have the language for it, was the way she had made them feel the edges of their own silence. Time, as it always does, moved on. The world changed again and again, shifting like sand underfoot. Wars ended, new ones began, dancers rose and fell, theaters opened and closed. Movements that were once scandalous became ordinary, and then were replaced by new ones that burned brighter for a brief moment. Yet somewhere beneath all that noise, Ida's shadow remained. It did not need to be seen to exist. It was a quiet presence, folded into the way art evolves, into the way a dancer breathes before taking the first step. And what of the woman herself, beneath the myth that outlived her? She had spent her life moving toward a kind of freedom most never find, not the freedom of wealth or applause or recognition, but the freedom of belonging only to one's own breath. She had carried it from a frost-covered window in St. Petersburg to a theater in Paris, from the fever of youth to the stillness of old age. She had lived as she danced, deliberately, without apology. The last image of her, for those who had known her near the end, was not on a stage. It was in a sunlit courtyard in the south of France, a woman with silver hair standing barefoot on warm stone, eyes half closed, hands lifted gently, as if feeling for the weight of the air, a movement so small it could have been mistaken for stillness. And yet, in that stillness, the entire arc of her life could be felt. The rebellion, the glory, the quiet, the endurance. This, perhaps, was the truest performance of them all. The legend of Ida Rubinstein would be told and retold, reshaped with each generation. Some would speak of her scandals, others of her beauty, others of her daring to step beyond the boundaries of what was allowed. But beyond all the retellings, there would always remain the simplest truth. She had danced, and in doing so, she had changed the shape of the silence around her. And long after the last theater light faded, long after the last critic wrote their final word, long after names of newer dancers rose and fell like waves, there would be some quiet moment in some quiet room, a hand pausing mid-gesture, a breath caught between beats, when she would be there, unseen, unheard, but there.